Thanks. Thanks, Mary Jean. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I know it might seem like tonight's topic is more of science and spirituality. Unfortunately, I never get a chance to join that session. So this is going to be a little bit of a blend of that, of how science leads us into conversation about spirituality. I recently graduated from a spiritual formation and companioning program. And in that program, I had to do an assignment on a modern mystic. And I chose a gentleman by the name of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And I'll just call him Teilhard. That's the name he goes by. He was an evolutionary thinker. And I'd like to present a very brief synopsis on his philosophy to sort of set a framework for us to have conversation around two key questions that I sort of picked up out of this for us to sort of wrestle with and share our perspectives. So please understand that there are people who do PhD thesis on this man, and I did a 12-page, assignment. So I'm just conveying some of the information about him and his studies and his research and his perspective. And so I'm not in any way an expert on Teilhard, but hopefully you'll get a taste of his philosophy that has affected me recently. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I could, Mary Jean. There we go. I'll do it. Would you maybe host? Okay, here we go. Okay. So as Mary Jean mentioned, the title of this that I gave it, just more of a kind of a headline grabber, the truth of evolution. I'm in no way I'm going to prove evolution as a theory, but I'm going to throw some perspectives towards you from Teilhard's tradition. But before I go to Teilhard, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. This question of evolution or creation is something that I've always wrestled with, even as a person who identified with faith tradition, and has a belief in God and the divine and the creator. But when I thought about the Big Bang Theory, not the TV show, but the actual science of the Big Bang Theory, I started asking myself, is it possible that it's not an either or answer to this question, that perhaps it's a both and? See, I always felt or kind of sensed that, could it be possible that we can envision this grand creator, this supernatural being, the divine presence of the universe, as someone who, if you're familiar with Star Trek, like Q on Star Trek, who could snap their fingers and sort of start the Big Bang, that the intention all along was that out of that, humans would evolve, as opposed to being just, snapped into creation at a moment's notice. As the Bible often says, a little bit of mud and some spit, wow, you've got humans. So I started questioning this, and I'm a man of science, so that's what I wrestled with. And so I kind of landed in this place of, is it possible that both are true? I never got an answer to that. I kind of just let that sit with me for years and years and years until I encountered Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who, as you can see, lived very recently. He died in 1955. So he was at the turn of the century. He was in his prime. So we're talking 100 years ago when a lot of his science and work came out. There's my screen again. He was a French scientist, teacher, paleontologist, philosopher, theologian, and Jesuit priest. So he was multidisciplined in his studies. So No wonder he had a lot of theories in mind. In fact, he helped co-discover Peking man. You may remember, there's a picture of him on the screen, the bones or the skull of Peking man that gave us a lot more information of our history from an archaeological and paleontological perspective. He wrote a couple of books, one, The Divine Milieu, and another, which is kind of his manifesto, called The Phenomenon of Man, which has been, I guess, edited a couple of times. So there's a more current version, but it's been touted as the best spiritual book of the 20th century. And what's so special about it? It's his life's work, kind of the culmination of his life's work, reconciling religion with scientific theory of evolution. So this intersection for him of science and spirituality, science and religion. He did not discount both. He was trying to sort of resolve them together, kind of respect both of them in their place. But his views on evolution actually were, at the time he wrote the book in the 30s. He didn't go to publish it till just before his death, and it never got published. He was never allowed to publish it by the Jesuits. But ever since his death, it's been a science that is gaining more and more and more acceptance. And for him, he saw evolution as a process that leads to increasing and increasing and increasing complexity. He describes, therefore, humankind as evolution becoming conscious of itself. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So there's this school of thought called the evolution of matter, which he subscribed to. And one of his famous quotes that he said is, "All around us, the physical sciences are ceaselessly discerning new relationships between the elements of the universe, that they're evolving amongst themselves." And he saw this as a fourfold sequence, starting with galaxies. So there's this galaxy, the galactic evolution of galaxies. The galaxies, from the galaxies emerged planets, and one of those planets happened to be Earth. And on Earth, life emerged, in different ways, cells and amoebas, and eventually plants and animals, and humans. And out of that came the consciousness evolution, the fourth stage. He sees the overall process as, and I love this term, creation becoming. Just that, not becoming anything in particular, but because it's constant. Creation is constantly becoming, constantly evolving. And so from the beginning, from atoms, evolving into stars, and eventually evolving, the universe expanding and evolving into galaxies, and in the galaxies emerged rocks, and then plants, and then animals, and eventually human beings emerged as part of a continual metamorphosis of this, this idea of leading to greater complexity. So we look back at all of these components of the universe, each one is more and more and more and more complex, which also leads to greater unity and leads to greater love, was his belief. So he saw humans as not separate from Earth or the cosmos, but one of its latest products. And that'll be one of our questions. But he did have a spirituality. He was a priest, and so his sense of spirituality begins with how he pictured God. He did see God in both the classical ways, the transcendent, the God that's farther away from us up in heaven, and the immanent God, which is closer to us, like internally, like inside us, as near to us as our breath, as the scriptures say. But he also proposed this third way, a comprehensive way, a way that, as the quote there says, that we live and move and have our being in. So his spirituality was as much to do with the earth, meaning matter. If you've ever heard the term matter matters, he embraced that. So it had as much to do with the earth as to do with humans. He saw the divine as disclosing itself through presence all around us in everything, through matter, through energy, and through presence. And he saw matter, that at the heart of matter, it had spirit, that matter itself had spirit. And throughout the course of evolution over eons of time, it saw this long rise in spiritualization, which became an inwardness, which manifested itself as an inwardness that becomes more conscious of itself through self-reflectivity. So human beings were the emergence of that, the culmination of that, and they were different, this higher level of complexity. They're different than plants and animals because they have this self-reflective inwardness that is more conscious of itself. And that consciousness has actually been present from the very beginning of the universe and not something that entered the universe later. The universe is constantly conscious of itself and evolving and growing in complexity. So this was his understanding of spirituality and the evolution of spirituality, and how humans evolved from that or emerged from that as a product of that evolution. So another one of his quotes is that there is communion with God. This is that transcendent way. There is communion with the earth. That's the immanent way, the nearer and farther. But the third way he proposed is how he frames it there. And then there's communion with God through the earth. And feel free to replace the word God with universe, divine, whatever your phrase is for God. So there is communion with God, communion with the earth, but then there's communion with God through the earth. So what is the future of evolution then at this point, and our role in it? He believes we play a part in the ongoing evolution of the consciousness of the universe, not just the consciousness of ourselves, but the consciousness that we contribute to that, the overall consciousness of the universe. You might have heard this phrase, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. There's no evidence that he actually said this anywhere. They can't prove it, but it is often attributed to him, even though it was popularized by, I think, Wayne Dyer. But one of the thoughts he had as far as evolution goes is that we would eventually get to this place called the noosphere, which he helped co-define, which is this new state of the biosphere that the planet has. It's a planetary sphere of reason, representing the highest stage of biospheric development. So at all levels, physical, spiritual, geological, and is defined by the development of humankind's rational activities. So reasoning, consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, evolving into more rationalization. And what's fascinating is this concept of the noosphere is this idea of, an unseen energy of connectedness, this sphere, this blanket around the earth that all beings and matter can communicate through. And I think that's rather fascinating, because if you think about what's going on in our atmosphere right now and how we are so interconnected with everyone and everything, from a science and technology perspective, through wireless information that we can't see or touch or feel, it's really freaky when you think about that and how that kind of sounds a little close to what this noosphere thing is. And I imagine if you were to suggest to him that our technology, Wi-Fi connections that exist today around the entire world, if you had told him about that, he would probably have a hard time believing it, or would have thought that that was the noosphere that we're talking about. So it's interesting that we kind of have this already, and we created it. Our consciousness, our effort, our contribution to the evolution of the universe, which he believes is on its way to what he called the omega point, an increasingly integrated consciousness of the human race will approach the universal consciousness of God. So when the consciousness of the human race, the integrated, this noosphere integrated consciousness of the human race approaches the universal consciousness of God, it will be an omega point. He didn't suggest how long it would be till we got there. It's been, what, 37 billion years since it started? So who knows how much longer it's going to be. But at this point, got a couple of questions that we can throw into the chat as we consider entering into conversation with one another and sharing our perspectives, or how some of these perspectives resonate with us. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Where do you sit with some of this thinking? So I'll let Mary Jean go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can enter into conversation.